Queen Anne of England endured 17 pregnancies during her marriage to Prince George of Denmark. Not one of her children survived to adulthood. For centuries, historians could only speculate about the cruel fate that haunted this royal couple, but modern medical science has finally uncovered the devastating truth behind one of history's most tragic dynasties. When Prince George was born in 1653 in Copenhagen, nothing suggested he would ever touch the English throne. He was the youngest son of King Frederick III of Denmark. Destined perhaps for a comfortable but unremarkable life, his mother came from a distinguished line of German dukes, giving him impeccable aristocratic credentials but little prospect of real power. When his older brother Christian V took the Danish crown, George seemed content to remain in the background, yet destiny had other plans waiting across the North Sea. The thing that made George attractive to England was not his charm or his military prowess. It was his Protestant faith. King Charles II desperately needed to secure Protestant succession, and his niece Lady Anne needed a suitable husband. George fit the requirements perfectly. The marriage negotiations proceeded in absolute secrecy. The Earl of Rochester and English Secretary of State corresponded with Danish officials in coded letters, terrified that information might leak to rival Dutch powers. The stakes were enormous, and one wrong move could trigger international scandal. In the summer of 1683, George and Anne finally married at St. James's Palace in London. The ceremony was modest by royal standards, but it marked the beginning of something unexpected. George and Anne genuinely liked each other. Their relationship blossomed into real affection and mutual respect, a rarity in arranged royal marriages. Within months, Anne discovered she was pregnant. The English court held its collective breath. The royal family desperately needed heirs, and everyone prayed this pregnancy would deliver a healthy child. They were disappointed, and gave birth to a stillborn daughter in the spring of 1684. The loss hit hard, but stillbirths were tragically common in that era. Nobody yet understood that this was merely the beginning of an unending nightmare. Anne and George tried to remain optimistic. The following year brought better news when Anne delivered a living daughter named Mary. Hope returned to the household. Another daughter, Sophia, arrived the year after. Two healthy girls suggested that whatever caused the first stillbirth had been a terrible accident, nothing more. But in 1687, horror descended on the family like a plague. Smallpox swept through London that year, and George caught the dreaded disease along with both his infant daughters. Anne, who had survived smallpox years earlier, could only watch in terror as her husband and children fought for their lives. The stress triggered something terrible in her body. She miscarried yet again, losing another potential heir. George recovered from the illness, his strong constitution pulling him through the fever and lesions. His daughters were not so fortunate. Both Mary and Sophia died within days of each other, their small bodies unable to withstand the disease. In less than a week, George and Anne's growing family had been reduced to nothing. Court observers reported that the couple had taken the deaths very heavily. That phrase, so restrained and proper, barely hints at the devastation they must have felt. George was not a man given to public displays of emotion, but those who knew him could see the grief etched into his features. Anne withdrew from court life, her face pale and drawn. They had lost 3 children in 3 years. Any hope of building a family seemed cursed, yet they had no choice but to keep trying. The succession depended on them producing an heir, and personal grief had to take a backseat to duty. Around them, England itself was sliding toward chaos. King Charles II had died in 1685, and Anne's father had ascended the throne as King James II. This elevated George and Anne's position at court, but it also placed them at the center of a growing political storm. James had converted to Catholicism decades earlier, and he now openly practiced his faith. For Protestant England, this was intolerable. Parliament seethed with resentment. James's own family members watched with growing alarm as he appointed Catholics to positions of power and began dismantling Protestant protections. George and Anne found themselves caught between loyalty to Anne's father and their own Protestant convictions. and became pregnant again at the end of 1687, desperately hoping for better luck. She gave birth to a stillborn son. The timing could not have been worse. While George and mourned this latest loss, shocking news arrived from the continent. William of Orange, Anne's brother-in-law and a fierce Protestant, was preparing to invade England. A Danish envoy brought George the intelligence in early November 1688. The information must have made his blood turn cold. England was about to plunge into civil war, and George would have to choose sides. George's response revealed unexpected political sophistication. He told the envoy that he would never take official command in King James's army. The king's soldiers were as discontented as everyone else, and George had no intention of leading reluctant troops into battle. At the same time, he was not quite ready to commit open treason. He decided to accompany the royal forces as a volunteer, a clever middle ground that kept his options open. George marched out with James's army, wearing his armor and presenting every appearance of loyalty. But as the days passed, he watched officer after officer defect to William's side. George reportedly cried out the same phrase after each betrayal: "Est il possible?" He kept saying in French, "Is it possible?" The repetition suggests genuine shock at the scale of the desertions. George apparently still held some hope that James could weather the storm, but when the defections continued day after day, George finally made his choice. On November the 24th, 1688, barely 3 weeks after William's invasion began, George abandoned James and joined William of Orange. His defection was the beginning of the end for King James. The king's reaction mixed bitterness with sarcasm. "So est il possible is gone too," James sneered when he heard the news. In his later memoirs, James downplayed George's betrayal, but witnesses reported that the king was visibly shaken when even the mild-mannered George turned against him. James must have known his cause was lost. By December, James had fled to France, giving up his crown to his daughter Mary and son-in-law William. The glorious revolution had succeeded, and George found himself on the winning side. William and Mary became joint monarchs in 1689, since they had no children, and became heir presumptive to the throne. George was now husband to the future queen, a position he had never sought and probably never wanted. William of Orange did not trust George despite his crucial defection. When George tried to join William's military campaigns, the king repeatedly blocked him. William refused to give George any command position, citing concerns about his military experience. The insult went deeper. William would not even allow George to travel in his coach during campaigns, and he reportedly ordered his Dutch guards never to salute Prince George. The humiliation was complete and deliberate. George eventually tried to join the Royal Navy instead, thinking he might find better treatment there. William blocked that too, making it clear that George would have no role in military affairs. Defeated and humiliated, George and Anne retreated from court life. But in the summer of 1689, a miracle occurred. Anne gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him William, Duke of Gloucester, and for the first time in years, George and Anne dared to hope. The little prince carried all their dreams for the future. With King William and Queen Mary still childless, baby William was now the most important Protestant heir in England. But there was something terribly wrong with him. At just 3 weeks old, the baby began experiencing violent convulsions. Modern historians believe he contracted meningitis during birth, which triggered the seizures. The same infection likely caused hydrocephalus, a condition where spinal fluid builds up in the brain and increases pressure inside the skull. The baby's head began to swell, a visible sign of the damage being done. Prince William survived his infancy, but he would never be truly healthy. His parents must have watched him with a mixture of joy and terror, grateful to have a living child but knowing he was desperately fragile, and kept trying to have more children. And the failures kept mounting. She gave birth to a premature daughter in 1690 who died within hours. A son born in 1692 lived only a few minutes. A stillborn girl arrived in 1693 and miscarried in 1694. The stress must have been unimaginable. But duty demanded they continue trying. Tragedy struck again in 1690 when smallpox returned. This time it claimed Queen Mary, Anne's older sister. England mourned its queen, and Anne lost one of the few people who understood her suffering. Mary's death also changed the succession, and went from heir presumptive to heir apparent, almost certainly guaranteeing she would eventually become queen. The pressure to produce more children intensified. Anne became pregnant twice in 1696 and miscarried both times. The same pattern repeated in 1697. Some historians believe at least 2 of those miscarriages involved twins, which would make the total number of lost children even higher. George and Anne's desperation must have been overwhelming. They kept trying because they had no choice, but each pregnancy now carried the weight of all previous failures. In total, Anne would experience at least 17 pregnancies during her marriage. Only one resulted in a child who survived infancy, and even he was gravely ill. The summer of 1700 brought the final devastating blow. Prince William, now 11 years old, attended a birthday party where he danced for much of the evening. The physical exertion proved too much for his weakened body. He took to bed feeling exhausted and soon developed a sore throat, chills, headache, and fever. His condition deteriorated rapidly. Just 1 week after his 11th birthday, on July the 30th, 1700, Prince William died with his heartbroken parents by his side. Doctors at the time suspected smallpox or bacterial meningitis. Modern medical experts believe he probably would have died young regardless, since his hydrocephalus was progressive and untreatable with the medicine available then. George and Anne had no time to properly grieve. The monarchy faced a succession crisis. In 1702, King William died of pneumonia at age 51. Anne ascended to the throne, and George became her royal consort. He was 49 years old, she was 37, and both carried a lifetime of accumulated grief. They had reached the pinnacle of power, but neither particularly wanted it. George had spent years being excluded and humiliated at court. Now he suddenly had access to everything he had once been denied, and gave him the positions William had always blocked. She made George Generalissimo of the English military and Lord High Admiral of the Royal Navy. The titles must have felt hollow after so much loss. George never tried to dominate his wife the way William had controlled Mary. He was content to let Anne rule while he supported her decisions. He followed her lead on policies and remained her loyal partner. One historian noted that George achieved something remarkable. Almost by accident, he proved that a male consort could support a female monarch without diminishing her power. It was an early, unintentional advance for feminism, though George probably never thought of it that way. George had suffered from asthma for years, and by 1706 his health was failing rapidly. On October the 28th, 1708, Prince George of Denmark died. One courtier described how Anne's sadness was unspeakable. She continued kissing George's body even after his breath had stopped, unable to let go of the one constant presence in her life. They had been married for 23 years and had lost at least 17 children together. Now Anne faced the throne alone. Modern medical researchers have spent years analyzing Anne's medical history, trying to understand what caused such catastrophic reproductive failure. At the time, doctors offered various theories, but none could truly explain the pattern of losses. Some suggested Anne had syphilis, but there was no evidence for that diagnosis. Others blamed her weight or her lifestyle, typical victim blaming that ignored the real medical causes. For centuries, the mystery remained unsolved. Contemporary medical experts now believe they understand what killed Anne's children. The most likely culprit is an autoimmune condition called antiphospholipid syndrome. This disorder causes the immune system to attack the body's own tissues, particularly affecting blood clotting. In pregnancy, antiphospholipid syndrome dramatically increases the risk of miscarriage, stillbirth, and premature birth. It can also cause the exact pattern of losses that Anne experienced. Another possibility is systemic lupus erythematosus, an autoimmune disease that often includes antiphospholipid syndrome as a complication. Lupus causes painful physical symptoms including joint pain and fatigue. which Anne reportedly suffered throughout her life. Both conditions can be managed today with proper medical care. Women with antiphospholipid syndrome take blood thinners during pregnancy, which significantly improves their chances of carrying a baby to term. Lupus can be controlled with immunosuppressive medications, and lived in an era before anyone understood autoimmune disorders. Her doctors could not diagnose what they could not see, and they had no treatments that would have helped. She suffered through 17 pregnancies without ever knowing why her body kept failing her. Prince George of Denmark deserves more than his reputation as a historical footnote. He lived through revolution, betrayal, political intrigue, and unimaginable personal loss. His marriage to Anne was marked by tragedy, but it was also characterized by genuine love and loyalty. Winston Churchill once wrote in the 1930s that George married very little except to Anne. Given everything they endured together, perhaps that was enough. George and Anne's story reminds us that power and privilege cannot protect anyone from grief. Even queens and princes suffer, lose children, and die without answers. But love endures. In the end, maybe that is the only legacy that truly matters. Thanks for watching. If you want to explore more forgotten stories from history, hit that subscribe button and join us for the next journey into the past.